Welcome to the charity breakout session, How to Access International Donations. This afternoon, we're delighted to have Emily Pingleton with us, who's the Senior Director of External Affairs from CAF America. Emily will be covering how charities can access international donations, the role of the CAF Friends Fund in enabling international donations, and CAF's experience in facilitating donations. Over to you, Emily. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Chris, and welcome everyone to the Worldwide Symposium on Philanthropy. My name is Emily Pingleton, and I am the Senior Director of External Affairs at CAF America. I'm so excited to present this session to you on supporting Australian charities with donations from the United States. And today I'll be discussing with you an overview of how cross-border giving from the United States works and different ways CAF America can work with you and your US donors to support your organization. So with that, on the next slide, I'll give you a little brief overview about CAF America. CAF America is a US-based international grant-making organization that assists corporations, foundations, and individuals make charitable grants around the world. US donors can't give directly to foreign charitable organizations and obtain a tax deduction. So CAF America, as a US public charity, is able to accept funding from US donors and with their grant recommendation, and then grant those funds directly to charitable organizations or projects around the world. So we work with a simple principle that we call the 3 R's. So first, we guarantee regulatory compliance, both in the United States and in Canada, as well as in each of the countries that we direct funding to. We also manage the risk of international grant making. So there are a lot of significant taxes and fines or even criminal charges in the case of failure to comply with US regulations on cross-border giving. So we mitigate that risk for US donors. And then we also protect the reputation of our donors as well. We have a deep due diligence process that we conduct on each of the charities that we grant to, and we manage the inherent risks of international cross-border giving. On the next slide, this is just a quick snapshot of CAF International's global footprint. We have offices and partners in 10 countries and on 6 continents, including with Good to Give here in Australia. And through these partnerships, CAF America has access to region-specific expertise and support in connecting US donors with organizations on the ground across the globe. On the next slide, I'd like to start by just briefly talking about the impact of COVID-19 on Australian nonprofits. Throughout the pandemic, CAF America conducted a series of reports on COVID-19 and how it has impacted the charitable sector, nonprofits, and our donor clients. We had over 3,500 charities responding to the survey, which dated back to the earliest days of the pandemic. And Good to Give supported CAF America in conducting a series of surveys with nonprofits in Australia, which enabled us to get a sense of how the sector was responding to COVID. What were some of the challenges they faced in response to the pandemic in terms of their operations, their financials, their programs, and then just to understand how the pandemic was really impacting the nonprofits around the world and how they were able to collect fundraising funds from donors. So this particular survey, we conducted a series of 7 surveys, but there was some surveys that specifically indicated that Australian charities revealed that they were concerned about the ability to survive within the next 6 to 12 months. And we specifically saw trends about the ability to survive, indicating that if they didn't receive any help from either government support or by other means, that they wouldn't be able to survive for much longer. So these trends are very concerning, and we do understand that there are challenges that nonprofits are facing in Australia. So I hope that this information in this presentation is valuable to you and to your US donors so they can continue to support the important work that you're doing in your country. On the next slide, I just want to highlight some of the work that CAF America and CAF Canada have done over the last 6 years. Since 2015, CAF America and CAF Canada have granted approximately 1,800 grants valued at 13.7 million Australian dollars to Australian charities. The majority of this funding was in 2019 for a few reasons. The first, we saw a significant uptick in donations due to the Australian bushfires in early 2020. And then, of course, with COVID-19, we saw a huge rise in the amount of donations that were granted to Australia for COVID-19 relief purposes. So on the next slide, I just want to talk about, how does cross-border giving work? How is it that your US donors can support your nonprofit in Australia? There are two ways that US donors can support Australian charities, and they both have different legal and tax implications that your donors must take into consideration. The first way is through a direct gift. So a US donor can make a gift directly to a nonprofit in Australia, but unfortunately, they don't receive a US tax benefit. The donor would be responsible for taking on the full risk of that donation. So there's a lot of regulatory compliance that's required in international grant making. Things like anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing requirements, US sanctions laws, and other regulations that the donor would be responsible for. And they don't receive that tax benefit. So the other method, which almost all funders use, is a donation through a US 501c3 grant maker. So in this case, the donor would make a grant through a US charity that grants the funds on to the intended beneficiary. They would receive a tax receipt for that donation, and it would remove the risk of international grant making in that case. CAF America does serve as a US intermediary grant maker, so we would take on the full compliance associated with international grant making, including all of the legal requirements and regulations that would be required for international grants. Some Australian charities have also opted to open their own US Friends of entity in the US to serve as a 501c3 intermediary. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the IRS rules around the governance and structure of these entities is very strict. And we often see examples where these organizations are not in compliance, which does put their donors at risk. And the cost to ensure compliance in the US is very high. So there's a lot to consider when you're managing your US donations and how your donors are receiving that US tax deduction. On the next slide, I just want to briefly talk about the three different types of intermediary services that CAF America can offer to nonprofits in Australia. So you're able to receive donations from US donors from three ways. The first is a single gift through our Expedited Grantmaking program. This is a partnership that CAF America has with Good to Give in Australia. The second method is a single gift through our Standard Validation and Grantmaking program. This is a direct relationship with CAF America. So you'd sign an agreement with CAF America and you'd receive the donations directly from our organization. And then the third option is establishing a CAF America Friends Fund. And I'll talk about each of these three ways in a little bit more detail next. So on the next slide, the first method I want to talk about is standard validation and grant making. Again, this is a direct relationship with CAF America. So before CAF America will make a grant to your organization, we'll first need to conduct due diligence on your organization. And there are two methods to complete this validation. The first is called expenditure responsibility, or ER. Essentially, this method is a review of your grant program, essentially to establish that this is a charitable activity that we're able to fund. This is for a specific project, so the funding is restricted to a specific purpose. Under this method, you would be required to sign a grant agreement with CAF America. You'd be required to submit annual reporting on that project, and you'd have to go through our validation process. The validation process typically includes a review of your governance structure, a review of your financial statements, your registration, your board and staff, and of course the grant purpose to understand how exactly the funds are going to be spent. The second option is called equivalency determination, or ED. And this is a much more stringent review of your organization. It's a lot more complex, and it essentially will determine that your organization is the equivalent of a US public charity. So this process can be very detailed, very cumbersome, very time-consuming and costly for an organization to complete. It's a very thorough review of your governance structure, your constitution, charter, bylaws. We have to see a proof of your nonprofit registration, description of your organization's activities, review of your financial statements for 5 years, And of course, we have to review your trustees and directors. So it can be a very time-consuming process, and not all organizations will pass or be deemed the equivalent of a U.S. public charity. However, if your organization does pass this process, the donations can be used for an unrestricted purpose, and you don't have to complete that annual reporting requirement as you would under ER. So those are just two different considerations. And again, this would be to receive grants directly from CAF America as one way to receive grants from your US donors. On the next slide is our Expedited Giving Partnership. So this is a program that we have set up with Good to Give. It's a way that US donors can provide immediate access for US donors to quickly support the charitable work that you do in Australia. Essentially, we have a partnership set up with Good to Give, where a donor, a US donor, will come to CAF America, make a donation with a grant recommendation to a specific charity. CAF America will then grant that funding to Good to Give with that charity recommendation. And Good to Give will manage the due diligence and grant making within Australia and grant that locally to the Australian nonprofit. So this service, this partnership is a lot more streamlined and can expedite the process quite a bit. If an organization were to go through CAF America's direct validation process, it usually takes about 3 to 4 weeks. And we do collect quite a few documents, like your governing document, your financials, your registration document, and other documents to complete our review. This wouldn't be necessary if you were to go through Good to Give. They would only be reviewing your registration number, address, and collecting your bank details to make that grant locally. So this does streamline the process quite a bit, and it does reduce the administrative burden on your organization by going through this process. This partnership has also been very instrumental in facilitating grants quickly, particularly when it comes to disaster relief. So for example, early last year when the bushfires were ravaging through Australia, CAF America was able to quickly get disaster relief funding to Good to Give to disperse locally to Australian charities in need. Very quickly, we granted over 2.2 million Australian dollars to bushfire relief causes. And usually, international grant making is very complex and a very detailed process that takes time. If each of these Australian nonprofits had gone directly to CAF America, this would have taken 3 to 4 weeks. Crucial time that these organizations couldn't use that relief funding. But through this partnership, we were able to expedite that process and get funding very quickly to these charities in need. And then our next method that you can use for getting US donations to your organization is something that what's called a Friends Fund. And Australian nonprofits can establish a Friends Fund at a hosting organization, which is a 501c3 public charity in the United States. And all funds received in this Friends Fund are restricted to benefit the Australian nonprofit. So this is a really exciting and cost-effective alternative for foreign charitable organizations who might wish to establish a 501c3 public charity to collect their US donations. This type of fund saves a lot of money and time to administer that public charity in the United States. And you'd still get the tax-deductible donations from any US donor. So some of the advantages of opening this type of fund are that you don't need to establish a 501c3 public charity. Again, this would be in place of that, and it would help to eliminate the high cost of work typically associated with opening that type of organization. You'd be able to solicit tax-deductible donations from US donors. You wouldn't need to manage a board or manage staff members like you would at an organization. You would be able to accept unlimited donations of any amount. There's no minimum balance. You could customize your donation page. You'd have a specific online portal that you could direct donors to. And then you wouldn't have to submit any reports to US states or the federal government like you would with a US 501c3 organization. So on the next slide, I've just outlined the differences between opening a Friends of or a 501c3 organization versus a CAF America Friends Fund, just to give you a sense of the difference between the cost difference, but also the time difference between opening these types of organizations or accounts. So registering as a US 501c3 organization is a very burdensome process, whereas opening a Friends Fund at CAF America is a lot more cost effective and much simpler. Just to give you a brief overview of what that 501c3 Friends of Organization registration process looks like, you'd first have to register your new organization in a US jurisdiction. So that includes recruiting a minimum of 3 board members, getting legal advice on how to create your organization's bylaws or articles of incorporation. You need to fill out several forms with the IRS. You'd have to apply for tax-exempt status and draft an organizational narrative that makes the case that your organization should be tax-exempt. Once you do complete those requirements, you'd likely be waiting several months to receive your 501c3 determination letter from the IRS. And then you'd have to register in every single state that your organization would be soliciting donations from. So currently there's about 40 US states that require some sort of registration process, and you wouldn't be able to solicit donations in any of those states without completing that process. And then you'd also be issuing tax receipts for every tax-exempt donation that you receive. So those are all the requirements for opening that US 501c3 organization. It can be very costly. You're going to be hiring legal counsel, and we've estimated that it costs about $22,000 US to go through that process. Alternatively, if you were to open a CAF America Friends Fund, you would need to fill out CAF America's grant eligibility application, pay an initial setup fee and an annual management fee, and then you'd have to pass CAF America's validation process. So that's approximately $3,500 to go through that whole process versus the $22,000 it would take to open a 501c3 organization. And then just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight on the next slide just 3 of the organizations that we work with who have Friends Funds in a set up with CAF America from Australia. We work with Great Barrier Reef Legacy, National Gallery of Victoria, and World Relief Australia, 3 great organizations who have Friends Funds set up with CAF America, who do channel all of their donations into this account, and then CAF America manages that grant making to these organizations from there. So with that, I'll just turn to the next slide. If you are interested in any of these services, you can reach out to info@cafamerica.org. Our team is happy to answer any questions you have specifically about Friends Funds, our single gift option, or our expedited grant making partnership with Good to Give. But if you have any questions, I definitely recommend reaching out to that info@cafamerica.org account. But I'm happy to take any questions here as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. We've got quite a few questions pouring in from the people who have joined us for this session. I'll start with the first one. How do impacts from COVID-19 on Australian charities compare to the charities in the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our surveys that we conducted were global surveys. So we conducted surveys in, I believe it was over 100 countries. And so, some countries we saw are struggling particularly difficult compared to nonprofits in Australia. So for instance, charities in South Africa are dealing with the food insecurity crisis on top of COVID-19. Organizations that are located in countries that have hotspots, have seen a very strong rise in COVID-19. So for example, India, Argentina, Brazil, Russia, these types of countries are experiencing very challenging environments in particular, just because they're dealing with that rise in COVID, but also the challenge that a lot of nonprofits in Australia are facing. So I think it really does, it does differ from country to country. But I would say there are some countries, like the ones I mentioned, that are struggling more so than, some of these more wealthy countries like the United States and Australia and the UK and others.
Thanks, Emily. No, that's really insightful. Thank you for sharing that with us. Are there any red flags that you look for in the due diligence process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our due diligence process, we take a risk-based approach. So we look at all different factors that a charity has. So for example, we're looking at governance structure. How long has the organization been in operations? Have they managed foreign donations before? What are the size of those donations that they're managing? Do they have the ability to manage a grant from CAF America? Do they have a large board, or do they have a single board member who's a sole decision maker? maybe they've had a large deficit over the last few years, or maybe they don't have a lot of financial reserves. So those are all different factors that we're evaluating within that due diligence process. I wouldn't say they're necessarily red flags, but those are definitely considerations that we're taking before making a grant to an organization. And as long as we're comfortable that the organization has the ability to manage a charitable project with the funding in compliance with our agreement, then we typically move forward in making that grant. And I would also say that once we approve a charity to receive grants from CAF America, they are eligible for grants, usually from a period of 1 to 3 years, where they don't need to redo that validation process all over again. They could receive grants, as many grants as they have within that period, and then they'll renew that eligibility once their eligibility expires.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question before we move into our next session. And that's what percentage of donations does the Australian charity receive when they're made through the Friends Fund?
So they'll receive all of the donations. CAF America does charge a fee on donations, and it really depends on the size of the grant. So the larger the grant, the smaller the fee, the administrative fee that we take. And all of that information about our fees and our Friends Fund fees and any costs that are associated with opening this account are listed on our website. So I can go ahead and share, or someone can share that resource with everyone, that link to our Friends Fund account webpage. And then that should list all of the fees that are associated with this option on that webpage for you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for sharing the exciting opportunities for Australian charities to easily access international donations, which have obviously historically been administratively challenging. I know Good to Give experienced this in action during the bushfires in 2020 and 2021, when donors from around the world were reaching out to see how they could support Australian charities who are responding on the ground. So I'm sure there'll be lots of participants listening to your information and reaching out for further information very soon.
Yeah,
thank you, Emily.
Thank you.